All right, ladies and gentlemen, Rufus R. Freight Train Jones and a cat Ernie Ladd. That's on your mind, I know.
Davey, that is the only thing that's on my mind. It's Ernie Cat Ladd. The man going around town, disown his people, disown me, disown everybody. I want to get Ernie Ladd out of range so bad, baby. So I want to put up $1,000 of my own money to get him on TV and let everybody watch me what I want to do to Ernie Ladd. I will tell you something, Ernie Ladd. You can run, brother, but you're too big to hide. And Rufus Jones find you, brother. I'm going to put something on you. It's $1,000, Ernie Ladd, to get you inside that ring with me.
In the world of territorial wrestling, where reputations were forged in dimly lit armories, high school gyms, and packed civic centers, toughness wasn't a gimmick. It was a requirement for survival. Men came and went, characters rose and faded, but every so often a performer arrived who didn't just fit into the landscape of his era, but seemed to define it. Rufus R. Freight Train Jones was one of those rare exceptions. Long before wrestling became a global television spectacle driven by production, Jones carved out his legacy in the National Wrestling Alliance's Central States and Mid-Atlantic territories during the 1970s and 1980s, a time when the line between performance and genuine grit often blurred. Rufus R. Jones carried himself with a confidence that didn't feel manufactured. Even his name carried weight in his presentation. That middle initial R, which he famously said stood for guts, wasn't just a catchphrase, but part of a larger persona built on endurance, pride, and stubborn refusal to be outlasted. In an industry filled with larger-than-life figures, Jones didn't need mythology added to him. He projected it through consistency. Night after night, he was the man opponents were sent to wear down, only to find themselves trapped in his rhythm instead. Before he became known across the territories as Rufus R. Freight Train Jones, he was Carrie Lloyd, a man whose life already seemed written in bold strokes long before he ever stepped through the ropes. Born on July 4th, 1933, in South Carolina, his arrival on Independence Day would later feel almost too fitting, as if he were destined to build a career defined by spectacle, resilience, and impact that couldn't be ignored. Lloyd grew up far from the spotlight of professional wrestling, but not far from competition. A gifted athlete, he first found his footing on the football fields of South Carolina State in Orangeburg, where size and toughness mattered as much as technique. At 6'1" and over 270 pounds, he carried the kind of natural frame that demanded attention, but it was his willingness to meet force with force that set him apart. That same drive carried him into boxing, where he compiled an impressive 32-win, 3-loss amateur record as a Golden Gloves fighter, learning early how to absorb punishment and return it with intent. In 1969, Lloyd made the transition that would define his life, shifting from the squared circle of the ring ropes to the squared circle of professional wrestling. Behind the scenes, Lloyd wasn't alone in his journey. He had a close friendship with Burrhead Jones, a bond formed in New York City in the late 1950s, when both men were still trying to find their place in the world. They weren't yet wrestlers, but they shared the same pull toward the sport and the same fascination with the larger-than-life figures who populated it. Men like Bobo Brazil, John and Chris Tolos, Mark Lewin, and Don Curtis. That shared ambition eventually led them both into the business, with both of them training at the Tony Santos Wrestling School in Boston, learning the craft that would eventually transform Lloyd into a territory mainstay. Before he became Freight Train, he experimented with identity the way many territory-era wrestlers did, searching for the version of himself that would stick. Early on, he performed under the name Big Buster Lloyd, a streetwise persona claiming to have honed his toughness on the corners of Lenox Avenue and 125th Street in Harlem. It was a character built on attitude and edge, a deliberate contrast to the local competition he, in character, dismissed as softer, less experienced, less real. Like many wrestlers of the territorial era, Jones spent his early years constantly on the move, traveling from promotion to promotion in search of opportunity. In 1969, he even crossed the Pacific to wrestle for the Japan Pro Wrestling Alliance, gaining valuable experience against an entirely different style of competitor. While many wrestlers spent years searching for the character that would define them, Lloyd was gradually discovering that his greatest asset wasn't necessarily what he could do between the ropes. It was what happened before he ever stepped into them. Somewhere along the way, Buster Lloyd evolved into Rufus R. Jones. The new persona was bigger, louder, and impossible to ignore. Jones embraced his natural charisma, developing the colorful interviews and infectious personality that would become his trademark. His nickname Freight Train perfectly captured the image he wanted to project, a powerful force that couldn't be stopped once it got moving. The name also found its way into his finishing maneuver, a devastating sequence of 2 crushing shoulder blocks followed by a headbutt that sent opponents sprawling. His style was unconventional, blending humor, showmanship, and larger-than-life confidence at a time when many promoters still preferred their wrestlers to fit more traditional molds. But fans understood him instantly. Wherever he went, audiences gravitated toward Jones because he felt genuine. He wasn't pretending to be a tough guy. He was a tough guy who happened to be entertaining. Nowhere was that connection more evident than in St. Louis under legendary promoter Sam Muchnick. During the 1970s, Jones became one of the territory's most beloved attractions, proving he could hang with the very best wrestlers in the world. In one of the defining performances of his career, he battled reigning NWA World Heavyweight Champion Dory Funk Jr. to a 60-minute draw before a sold-out crowd at the historic Kiel Auditorium. The result elevated Jones from popular regional star to a legitimate contender in the eyes of many fans. On September 10th, 1970, Jones captured his first title when he teamed with Danny Little Bear to win the Central States version of the NWA North American Tag Team Championship. More title reigns followed with partners such as Steve Bolus, The Stomper, and Bob Geigel, cementing his status as one of the territory's most reliable and popular performers. But the most important matches of Jones's career weren't the ones that resulted in championship belts. In 1976, he pushed NWA World Heavyweight Champion Terry Funk to a 1-hour draw in Winston-Salem, a remarkable achievement against one of the toughest champions in wrestling history. Months later, he even managed to defeat Funk by disqualification. While the world title remained out of reach, something arguably more valuable was happening. Rufus R. Jones was becoming one of wrestling's most beloved underdogs. If Rufus R. Jones spent the early years of his career earning respect, it was in the Mid-Atlantic territory where he became a legend. By the mid-1970s, Jones had become one of the promotion's most beloved stars. Fans packed arenas to see the Freight Train. Whether he was delivering one of his colorful interviews or battling one of wrestling's most hated villains, Jones had an uncanny ability to make audiences feel emotionally invested. That connection with the fans reached its peak in 1976, during what became one of the hottest feuds in Mid-Atlantic wrestling history. Rufus R. Jones versus United States Heavyweight Champion Blackjack Mulligan. The rivalry was built on more than championship gold. It was personal, with Blackjack Mulligan even later admitting he was scared for his life during it. The trouble began when Mulligan targeted Rufus's longtime friend and storyline cousin, Burrhead Jones. In one of the territory's most shocking angles, Mulligan repeatedly leaped from the top turnbuckle onto Burrhead's neck. Mulligan eventually enlisted the help of fellow rule breakers Ric Flair and the Andersons. Together, the group carried out one of the most memorable beatdowns in Mid-Atlantic history. The attackers first restrained Rufus and forced him to watch as Mulligan repeatedly jumped from the top turnbuckle onto Burrhead Jones, leaving him hospitalized. Later, with Ric Flair and Gene and Ole Anderson holding Rufus helpless, Mulligan climbed to the top rope and crushed the crown that symbolized Jones's status as the fans' king of wrestling. The humiliation continued as the villains slapped Rufus across the face and mockingly placed a chauffeur's cap on his head. Before Jerry Lawler became synonymous with the title of the King, Mid-Atlantic fans had already crowned Rufus R. Jones their king. It wasn't a nickname handed down by promoters or dreamed up in a booking meeting. It came organically from the audience. They loved Jones's personality, admired his perseverance, and saw him as their champion whether he held a title belt or not. The attack on his crown wasn't simply an assault on a wrestler, it was an assault on the fans themselves, and they responded exactly as the promotion hoped. The heat generated by the angle was extraordinary. Mulligan later recalled that the hatred directed toward him became so intense that his car was vandalized after the angle. The feud itself burned brightly but briefly, yet its impact endured for decades because it perfectly encapsulated everything that made Rufus R. Jones special. He wasn't the world champion. He wasn't positioned as the face of the company. But when audiences saw him fighting against impossible odds, standing up for family, and refusing to back down from a gang of bullies, they responded with a passion few wrestlers could inspire. Years later, even Mulligan himself would look back on Jones with tremendous admiration, calling him one of the greatest human beings he had ever known. It was a fitting tribute. Behind the colorful promos, the infectious smile, and the freight train persona was a man who had earned the respect of nearly everyone who shared a locker room with him. Part of what kept Jones over with audiences was his interview style, which stood out even in an era defined by colorful talkers. Jones didn't rely on scripted cadence or polished delivery. His promos felt loose, energetic, and unpredictable. Part sermon, part comedy, part challenge. He could turn a phrase in a way that made crowds laugh one moment and erupt the next. In a wrestling landscape filled with larger-than-life personalities, Jones didn't try to outdo anyone. He simply sounded like himself, and that was enough. Even as the wrestling industry began to shift toward a more consolidated national model, Jones remained a familiar and respected presence in regional promotions. His career wasn't defined by one singular peak, but by longevity, by the ability to stay relevant, stay over, and stay moving long after many of his contemporaries had faded from the spotlight. That consistency carried all the way to the end of his in-ring career. On September 10th, 1988, in Puerto Rico's World Wrestling Council, then operating under Capital Sports Promotions, Jones wrestled his final match at the appropriately titled A Hot Night in Bayamon. Teaming with Jimmy Valiant, he defeated the legendary team the Wild Samoans by disqualification. It was a fitting final chapter. Chaos, star power, and the kind of old-school tag team atmosphere that had defined much of his career across multiple decades. Outside the ring, Carrie Lloyd's life was full and grounded. He was married to Brooksy Jones Lloyd for 30 years, and together they raised a family that included 3 daughters, Melanie, Crystal, and Kendall, as well as an adopted son, Kenneth Johnson. Kenneth would go on to work in the World Wrestling Federation as the flamboyant manager, the Doctor of Style Slick, extending the family's presence into the next generation of wrestling history. After retiring from active competition, Lloyd didn't step away from working entirely. He returned to the Midwest and worked in security alongside promoter Bob Geigel at a dog racing track in Kansas City, a quieter but steady post-wrestling life, far removed from the roar of packed arenas. Eventually, he leaned back into the world that had defined him, opening Rufus's Ringside Restaurant and Bar in Kansas City in 1991, a place that carried his name and, in a way, his legacy. On November 13th, 1993, Carrie Lloyd died of a heart attack while deer hunting in Brunswick, Missouri. He was 60 years old. His passing was met with respect across the wrestling world, and his funeral reflected the broad impact he had made throughout his life and career. Fans, friends, and fellow performers gathered to pay their respects. Rufus R. Freight Train Jones left behind more than a list of matches, championships, or territories traveled. He left behind a reputation built on consistency, personality, and connection. Proof that in professional wrestling, being unforgettable doesn't always require being the biggest star on the card, only the one people never stopped believing in. Whether battling world champions, standing up to villains like Blackjack Mulligan, or entertaining fans with his unique personality, the Freight Train left an impression wherever he went. Decades after his final match, Rufus remains remembered, not only as one of wrestling's toughest competitors, but as one of its most authentic and beloved figures, a man whose legacy continues to roll on, long after the train left the station.